Hello to everybody online. Hello to everybody in person. My name is Janine Elliott. I am an associate director at a group here at the Office of Research called Venture Catalyst. And as Dr. Slaughter was just mentioning, a lot of innovations happen in the field or happen in the course of research, but a lot of those things maybe don't necessarily make it out into commercial use. And so today I'm going to take an opportunity to sort of show some of the best practices in translating that technology from the lab or from a test field out into use at scale. And then also, there'll be a couple of other opportunities to also explore this question of sort of what makes a good venture, what doesn't. And I'm going to try to blow through some of these concepts somewhat quickly. Just think of it as an opportunity to acquaint yourself to some frameworks, to certain vocabularies. And then we're going to try to open it up for questions, because usually some people are really interested in intellectual property, or some people are really interested in technology development, or some people are really interested in the funding. So I want to give you all a chance to dial in on whatever question it is that you have, to go in from there. So there we go. And part of why I'm here today, just as a background on me, I've been working with science and technology innovators, translating that technology from lab to market for about 10 years now. I had a startup myself, and actually I made a ton of the mistakes that I'm hoping that innovators don't have to repeat. And so I've had the privilege of working with people on neonatal innovations, innovations where people took rice husks, mixed them with mycelium, and basically made an alternative to styrofoam that now is used by IKEA and other companies that do a lot of volume and shipping of heavy products that are also fragile. And then one that we're going to do a case study on here today is a company called Hazel Technologies. And they do a bunch of stuff with post-harvest fruit and vegetable preservation. And so I love all this stuff. I'm really excited to be here. And now I work with Venture Catalyst, which is a group out of the Office of Research. And we work really closely with our tech transfer office here at UC Davis called Innovation Access. And basically, we try to be that bridge between that research and the marketplace. So Innovation Access handles all of the intellectual property. I'm going to give a little overview of intellectual property over the course of my talk, but those are really the experts on this space. But they also are handling a lot of the legal stuff and a lot of the contracts and the licenses and all that stuff. So at Venture Catalyst, we're really focusing on helping the innovators themselves translate that technology into a product that could actually be actively marketed. And we do this in part because there's a little story of how it can be really hard to go from that initial research or that initial idea to the end result of profits. So does anybody know about these little gnomes here with a big pile of clothing? Does anybody recognize this? This is like a kind of dated reference from a couple of years ago. But in South Park, there was this episode where the children's underpants kept disappearing. And it turned out that there were these gnomes that were stealing all the children's underpants because they thought that if they got enough of them, they would then sell them to somebody and get wildly rich. And so there was this whole thing where they were like, here's our strategic plan. 1, gather the underpants. 2, question mark. 3, profits. And it's amazing how many investors or how many entrepreneurs and inventors tend to kind of think that way. So we want to break that habit as quickly as possible so that people can be much more strategic about how they develop their technology and how they move forward. And so I had the privilege of working with a really fantastic organization, a nonprofit called VentureWell, for a number of years. And basically, they work with STEM innovators across disciplines, across technologies, all in service of social and environmental impact, including agricultural technologies. And so this was a framework that I co-authored with a couple of my colleagues. And so what you're seeing here is that there can, and we'll keep referring back to this framework over the course of my talk. But yeah, basically, there are a couple different ways on this far left side of the image that people come up with their ideas. Some people are starting with the fundamental research, and then they ask the question, okay, who might use it, or what's the use case for this? Or they're doing some sort of research, and then they invent the robot to help them with their research. Sometimes people use a process called design thinking, or sort of other methodologies where they start with a societal problem or a problem that they're seeing in the marketplace where there isn't already an existing solution, and then they try to invent something to fill that gap. Both are equally valid. It's just different people tend to come at their ideas or their inventions in a different way. And so at some point, they're like, oh, okay, light bulb moment. I think this is how this is going to work. I have my invention idea. Or in the case of, say, public health or worker well-being, where it's more of a behavioral change, we usually call that an intervention. So anyways, there's some sort of innovation that happens there. And what I found is that people tend to take these next two steps, customer value articulation and business model development, or the model for how they're going to actually get it out into the world. They just kind of gloss over that part. That's like the question mark part of the underpants gnome story. And they kind of jump straight to venture formalization and getting incorporated and saying, okay, now I'm going to go raise investment money and I'll figure out the rest later. Or they say, okay, cool, tech transfer office, go file a patent and figure out who's going to license it. And neither of those strategies tend to be very efficient in the long run. They seem like the easy step, but they're actually very inefficient. So in a perfect world, in an ideal situation where a startup is really efficient with their time and their resources, they actually take the time to figure out which customers are in most need and with the highest willingness to pay at the very beginning for their product. And then they can scale up to other products or other customers after that. But you got to start really specifically, and I'll give an example of that in a minute. And then once you understand who that customer is and why it's truly valuable for them, then you can figure out how you're going to sell it or how you're going to disseminate it. Are you going to post it on Amazon and then Amazon's logistics services are going to take care of it for you? Do you have to go through a dealer and retailer network? What might that look like? And ideally, people have kind of sketched all of that out while they're developing their technology, while they're developing their intellectual property strategy, so that by the time they're ready to incorporate their venture and start fundraising, they can just hit the ground running and they can move so much faster and so much more efficiently with the money that they get at that point. So I'm going to take an opportunity to walk through some examples, and then as we go through, I'm going to hit on these 4 buckets of information relative to this framework about how these different topics sort of work together and in concert with one another as an innovation goes from being an innovation to potentially a commercial product to potentially a venture. Or a venture that then develops and sells a commercial product. You can kind of think about it both ways. Some people don't want to do a startup, but they still want to impact the world with their research. And so another example of this is Dr. Dudkovsky. He focuses on wheat. He's been basically, if you've had a high protein, high nutrition wheat variety in your diet, it probably came from his lab. And he's been doing this for 30 plus years. And so he's kind of an example of a guy who started with the research and then said, wow, I could optimize this wheat for higher nutrition. Oh, I could optimize this wheat for drought tolerance. oh, turns out triticale, which usually only gets fed to animals, is actually super nutritious. I wonder if I could make a triticale version that people could eat. And so for him, he had to do some digging before he could just sell his varieties to the seed companies. He, again, was really savvy about figuring out what the customer really needed. And so it turned out that if he wanted the seed companies to buy the seed, or in this case, license the seed varietal from UC Davis, he needed to get the buy-in of the farmers. And in order to get the buy-in of the farmers, he needed to get the buy-in of the wheat millers who wanted to work with it. And then it turned out that the wheat millers really cared about what the bread makers cared about the wheat, because if nobody was going to buy the milled wheat, they didn't want to carry it, right? And so he really had to take that systems perspective while developing his wheat varietals. But what's great about that is that now he did all of that licensing work. He worked with UC Davis's Tech Transfer Office Innovation Access, and now that license is a non-exclusive license out to multiple wheat seed breeding companies that now allows that bread to be out in the world at scale. And so in his case, he chose not to do a startup, but he chose to have UC Davis handle the licensing, and then he, as the inventor, gets a portion of the royalties that come back to the university for him and his lab and his department. And that's kind of how he gets incentivized to do this, other than the fact that he's just a great human being that cares about global nutrition. So moving down the list to technology development and this process of going from technology development to product development. And just by show of hands in the audience, does anybody familiar with this concept of technology readiness level, or TRL? No, okay, cool. So this is a mechanism that actually started with NASA and then got picked up by Department of Energy, Department of Defense, EPA, et cetera. I don't know if USDA has really adopted it, to be honest with you, but basically it's a term that gets used a lot in the technology community and the investment community to articulate where the technology is on its trajectory from idea or from fundamental research all the way to actually being deployable in the field. So with NASA, TRL1 was, well, the principles of the physics of what we're trying to do are established, and here's my lit review that shows that this is hypothetically plausible, all the way to number 9 being, hey, we deployed our system in space. And so in this case, with food and ag, it's definitely a little less ambitious than launching stuff into space, but the principle still holds the same, where usually that ideation, research, invention phase is sort of TRLs 1 through 3. And then ideally, you're doing that prototyping, you're sort of putting the pieces together, you're doing some stuff at bench scale or lab scale, depending on what exactly the technology is. But you're starting to create a thing, whether that's a technology or formulation or a social intervention or whatever that might be. And you're kind of doing that concurrently with getting that customer feedback and that systems feedback, so that you're making sure you're building the right thing while you're going along, right? And then that idea is that by the time you get to TRL 7 and you're really able to do demonstrations in the field, or you're able to put a product that's consumer facing out on Amazon or out on Etsy and see who buys it, or do a crowdfunding campaign or something like that and see who buys it. Usually TRLs 6, 7, 8 is where investors also tend to get most excited, because they know that there's enough, as we say, there's enough of a thing to sort of grasp. It's been de-risked. And now that opportunity to partner with a larger company, or for that licensor to be excited about the work that's been done is usually where that comes up, such that when you're really ready to commercialize at TRL 8 or 9, you've got paying customers and you're really ready to replicate and scale up. And I thank very much this article here for providing this awesome graphic that just really sums it up quite nicely. In talking with a program officer at the National Science Foundation, this is just an alternative way to think about it when you think about R&D, research and development. So he would say, in the context of R&D, you've got your big R, you got your little r, you got your big D, you got the little d. And you can sort of see how the emphasis on research versus development sort of shifts over the course of that lifespan of that technology. And then by the time you get to the far end at TRLs 8 and 9 for your initial product, that's when you're starting to do R&D for your next product for that same customer, or you're doing R&D with the same technology, but for new customers. So like that's what we saw with Hazel Technologies, right? Like by the time they got to TRLs 7, 8, 9 with their strawberries, they were already doing TRLs 4, 5, 6 with stone fruits. And then by the time their stone fruits were really ready to scale up, now they're on to potatoes and okra and a bunch of other stuff. So, you know, that's sort of how they then sort of can stair stack that path to scale, as opposed to trying to go from a lab experiment to suddenly having a bunch of venture capital. You know, it's sort of like you're still building the airplane and then you get a bunch of jet fuel. It doesn't really compute. But if you've built the airplane and you have your destination in mind, and then you get the jet fuel, now you can really go. So now I'm going to switch gears over to intellectual property, because of course, while all of this technology development is going on, and while you're articulating your customers, you're building up intellectual property. And so basically, this is going to be intellectual property, bare bones 101. Again, I'm happy to get into it during Q&A. I am not a lawyer, but I briefly entertained the idea of doing intellectual property more professionally. So I'm happy to geek out on this with you. But basically, there are 4 types of intellectual property. So there's trademark. You could think about, you know, the brand Coca-Cola with its swirliness. We all recognize it. We all recognize the logo of a Pepsi and how that's different from a Coca-Cola, whatever that might be, right? So there's trademark. Then there's copyright. And so that's usually what we're thinking about when we think about music or written work, or in this case, computer code now falls under copyright law. Then there are patents. And I'm going to come back to patents because that's actually the main focus of what I'm about to discuss. And then there's trade secrets. And trade secrets, again, coming back to Coca-Cola, the famous example is that the Coca-Cola recipe in its entirety has never been published. And they always would keep the steps sort of isolated from one another so that different people in the Coca-Cola manufacturing process never got to see the whole picture, and they could keep their secret recipe. Now, of course, in this day and age, you can just reverse engineer it and, you know, throw a mass spec on it or something and find out everything that's in it. But in the old days, that's sort of one way that you could have protected your intellectual property instead of a patent, by just keeping it really secret. And we still see trade secrets used somewhat in the software space, where people want to keep that as private as possible because otherwise people can just sort of engineer around it really quickly. Sometimes we see trade secret in the fracking industry is sort of an example of that, where they said, well, we can't tell the government what's in our hydraulic fracking fluid because it's a trade secret. And so it's sort of interesting ways that can be used. But by and large, the reason patents are so popular and so effective as an intellectual property mechanism is that you can really think about them as 3 things. You could think of them as your sword, your shield, or your golden goose. And what I mean by that is the main purpose of a patent is to create a temporary monopoly on your ability to make and sell your invention or whoever owns the patent. And so you're blocking other people from being able to use your patent. And if they do, you get the royalties or you get damages from them if they don't stop. So it's on you to defend yourself with your sword, with your patent, but you can defend yourself because you published a patent that says, hey, this is my territory. Now, somebody else might have also come up with a similar invention around the same time as you. And so you could also think of this patent as a shield. It doesn't exactly protect you from other people who are doing similar things, but it at least sort of draws a soft fence around you that says, hey, I didn't realize I was encroaching on your territory. I have this patent that got granted, so somebody thought I was doing something novel. Can we at least negotiate? Or can we at least cross-license with one another and like kind of broker a little peace treaty here? So like in the example of Apple and Samsung, they invented something basically at the same time. They both got granted patents, and then they both countersued each other in some of the most expensive lawsuits in like patent litigation history. And so ultimately, they ended up cross-licensing to each other, and that's how they settled that dispute. They said, well, fine, you can use it, I can use it, but we'll just make sure nobody else can use it. And then finally, the main reason that, for example, universities or inventors really like intellectual property and patents is because they're the golden goose that laid the golden eggs. So once you do have a customer that's licensing out the technology, then you get royalties back. And those royalties just kind of keep coming in at small increments. You know, we're usually talking 2-3% of the revenue. It's not a ton of money, but if all of your customers are out there and they all owe you royalties, those little percentages start to add up. And at that point, it becomes kind of passive income, which can be really nice for people. Or if your startup goes under and your investors have some sort of clause in it that says, well, then the IP reverts back to them. Now they have an asset that they can sell to somebody else and maybe get a little bit of their investment money back. So that's sort of why patents get used as an asset for a couple of different reasons. Now, one of the questions that I usually get, and this can be a sort of a point of confusion for a lot of people, is what's going on if you were just to be doing this all by yourself? And what's going on if you're doing this in tandem with the university? So actually, just to be clear, how many people in the audience right now are either a university student or a university employee? Okay, so for a handful of you, that first line might be relevant in the yellow. But for those of you who might be an inventor, that bottom line in the blue is also going to be a part of the picture, most likely. So basically what you're seeing in the yellow at the top here is, you know, you start out with filing a provisional patent most of the time. Now you can just go straight to filing a non-provisional patent, but those are typically much more expensive to file and design. So most people start with a provisional. And it's basically your way of telling the USPTO, the US Patent and Trademarks Office, hey, I invented something and I invented it first. And here's what I invented. And I'm going to come back to you within a year with a full description of what that means. But here's my dibs on this invention at this particular point in time. So that way, if anybody else invents something just like it, within that year, you still get that priority date. That's the idea there. Now, let's say you did that provisional patent filing with a lawyer because you're an independent inventor. You paid, you know, maybe a few $1,000s to get that drawn up, and you sent it in, and you paid the fees to the patent office. And during that time, hopefully, you were getting to know your customers better, you're iterating on your prototype, you're doing all of those things that we were talking about on the Hazel Technologies example, or Dr. Dukovsky's example, or the iteration and prototyping example, right? So like you're making progress on those fronts such that then when you file the non-provisional, you can add a couple of more claims on it. You can articulate the use cases for how your technology would be used and by whom. And at that point, hopefully you have a really good justification for why you're about to spend, between $15,000 and $50,000 on filing this patent, because you're really sure there's a business case and a customer there that makes it worth doing so. That's why I'm personally such a fan of that customer value articulation and model development step before just incorporating and filing a non-provisional willy-nilly, because you can save yourself a lot of money by doing some of that homework first. Then, once you've done that non-provisional step or done what's called a PCT, which is basically a multi-country cross-nation treaty that says that different countries will honor each other's filing dates and sort of patent laws to a certain extent. That's when you would move into basically choosing which countries you want to also file your patent with. And different countries have different rules around that. But if you're planning on becoming a multinational company, such as the way Hazel Technologies has, they now have operations in Europe. They have operations in Chile. They have operations in Australia. Like, they're doing work in Africa because Africa imports into Europe. So like they needed to actually create a big laundry list of all the countries where they were going to need protection, so that they could defend their IP no matter where they were doing business. But they only had to really focus in countries where they were doing business. They don't need to protect their technology in Botswana because they're probably not doing business in Botswana, right? So they can choose where to be and why and how. And then the thing that can really sneak up on a lot of startups is the recurring maintenance fees. So they do have to pay fees to the USPTO. They do have to pay fees to those countries to maintain the value of their patent over the course of the 20 years or so that they exist. Now, if you are an employee of the university, meaning that you're a grad student, a staff member, postdoc, faculty member, what would usually happen is you would invent something and then you would do an invention disclosure to Innovation Access, or what's called a record of invention, or an ROI. And at that point, the people at Innovation Access would evaluate the technology, decide if it has commercial potential, and if it's worthwhile to patent it. They would then come back to you and either say, yes, we're moving forward with patenting it, or no, it's up to you if you want to patent it, at which point you would just revert back to that yellow line. And they would usually do that either because they just don't have the time and energy to deal with it, they don't think the market potential is going to be large enough, or they realized that you put enough of your own resources and time and energy into it outside of your job function that the university really doesn't have any claim on it. Let's say they go ahead and file the provisional, they file the non-provisional, you think you want to do a startup, you're entitled to what's called a fast agreement. And basically, again, it's a way of calling dibs. It keeps the university for 1 year from publishing that they're going to have this IP up and available for license on our website or other public domains. And so during that year, you basically get to vet whether or not the technology is any good. You get to vet whether or not there's a business case for it, all that good stuff. It sort of buys you some time as an employee or a student with that technology. Usually people would go from a fast agreement to an option agreement, where then they do have to pay some fees, but then they get certain privileges for being able to use the technology, say in field tests or in certain ways. And then usually then people go into a licensing agreement where you get, various rights to how you're going to use it, where you're going to sell your product, et cetera. And then there are various terms that go into that contract around reimbursing the office for some of the expenses it's paid, negotiating royalty fees, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, that's a whole other talk, so I'm not going to go into that, but I'm happy to answer questions if you want. And then the last one, that last box is that, like, let's say you've licensed it, or let's say you've done all of your filings and you're an independent entrepreneur, and now you have a package of intellectual property that you want to license out to a major corporation or to multiple major corporations so that, again, they do the scale up for you and you collect the royalties. That usually happens a little later on with sub-licensing and royalty remittance. Let's say you did really well, then some of that might come back to the university, and that's how royalty remittance might work. But that just sort of gives you a feel for that life cycle. And then finally, especially with our proximity to Silicon Valley, this is usually one of the questions that I get the most, which is, how on earth does funding work? How do people actually get these things from lab to market? Everyone always needs money. So this is just sort of my mock-up of different ways that funding mix might work. So it might be easier to focus on the bottom line first, or that bottom set of boxes, and then I can kind of go through some of the examples that represent those boxes. So grants are a really big source of that input, especially really early on. And those grants can take a lot of forms. Maybe it's fundamental research grants from the National Science Foundation. Maybe it's a STARE grant, a translational research grant that's from UC Davis Venture Catalyst if you're a researcher here. Maybe it's a sponsorship or some sort of sponsored project from the California Almond Board if you're dealing with almonds, so on and so forth. So you're getting those grants, and usually that's for that really early translational stuff where you're defining what this invention is, you're figuring out who's going to use it and why, so on and so forth. So like one of the speakers that you're going to be talking to today, Dr. Corsandi, works a lot with ATVs and farm worker safety. She has a big grant from NIOSH, which is focusing all on worker safety, and so they're paying for the grant for the product development there, because they already understand the customer need, but now they have to really define the invention and make sure the invention works. Usually then, when people have those grants and they're getting ready to move into what a business model that works is, where the technology is, right where I have that part that says SBIR, STTR, that's usually TRL, maybe 2.5 to 4, right? And so this is an area where the federal government has a bunch of really cool grant-making programs that strictly are for R&D for small businesses. And small businesses, I think, are 500 employees or less. So that's a lot of small businesses, but especially groups like the National Science Foundation, USDA, EPA, Department of Energy, they really like to direct their SBIR funding, not just to small businesses for innovation research, which is what SBIR stands for, to just any small business. They really like to put it towards startups. So teams of 2 to 10 people, typically. Now, let's say you've actually done some of that SBIR, STTR work. Maybe you're also concurrently going to get some money and training from a group like Thrive Accelerator. And so Thrive Accelerator is an organization based down in the Salinas Valley that's like one of the premier entrepreneurship training and ag funding groups for seed stage entrepreneurs in the area. We currently have one team that actually got one of our STARE grants, who's now in the Thrive program, and I believe they're filing for SBIRs very soon. So you can sort of start seeing the connection of the dots there. In the case of Hazel Technologies, they actually started out with a grant from VentureWell, sort of right where that UC Davis logo would have been. They had a student grant and some training from VentureWell at that point. Then they went and got an SBIR from the USDA. Then they went to the Thrive Accelerator. Then they got seed stage or Series A stage venture capital from Rhapsody Venture Partners. And then when they had really scaled up and proved that they could do all of this, and all they really needed was that jet fuel, that's when investors like DBL Partners, who actually focus on climate change, they don't even really care about ag tech, they just care about climate change, could really see the big picture of what they were doing. And then they came on board. So basically, it typically goes in the funding mix from grants to getting Series Seed, which is angel money, angel investors, who are individual investors with high net worth, or accelerators like Thrive that put in money, $100,000, $200,000. Not a ton of money, but a lot of money that can have a lot of impact really early on. If people do well in their Series Seed, then that's what gets them to a Series A, where they're again dealing with angels or venture capitalists. And then usually by the time they're getting to a Series B, they're working with venture capitalists, or they're even working directly with major corporations who have their own strategic venture capital arm. And then finally, usually that leads to either mergers and acquisitions with those sort of big brother corporations, or that leads to initial public offering or IPO, listing on the stock market. So I know I just threw a ton at you, and this deck is going to be available in your course folder for your review. But given that this just scratches the surface, and maybe you're an innovator that's excited to figure out what you need specifically to move next from wherever you are, I just wanted to touch on a few on-campus and off-campus resources for any innovators in the room, or anyone who might know innovators that should get plugged into the system here. So there are a ton of people on campus at UC Davis that support agriculture, innovation, and entrepreneurship. You'll recognize a few of these. The World Food Center is on here. The Office of Research, which is where I'm based, is on here. Folks from the engineering department, folks from global affairs, folks from the School of Medicine doing foods for health. There's a lot of different stuff going on campus. But what I'd really like to draw your attention to is just a couple of key resources that can be really valuable depending on what stage of the process you're in. So the first one I'd like to draw attention to is the Mike and Renee Child Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. They have entrepreneurship academies that run a couple times a year, and I believe one of those academies is even ag focused. And it's just a really great opportunity to look at the big picture for your business idea and refine the idea, refine these ideas about who your customer might be, figure out who your competitors might be or the substitutes might be. Just sort of the big picture stuff. How do you even communicate about your idea so that you can get feedback? And then they have a really great program also called Big Bang. This is open to students, staff, and faculty affiliated with higher education institutions in California, UC Davis being a key focus since we're here. And that actually does offer mentorship, cash prizes, and just a really great opportunity to keep building business skills for a technical audience. It's specifically designed for people with technical backgrounds. But they do tend to stop sort of right around that stage where you're coming up with a value proposition for your customer. And then they're really making handoffs to other people in the ecosystem at that point. So there's an accelerator program here on campus, a business boot camp training that's 12 weeks long called Plasma, run out of the engineering school. And that's mostly geared towards students and even mostly undergrad students. So that's a resource for at least some of the people in the room. And then there are just tons of networking events with Seed Central. And even though they're mostly focused on the seed and breeding industry, they do span many other aspects of agriculture, foods for health, and sort of everything in between, processing and so on. So I would highly recommend getting on their mailing list and going to some of their events. They're now in person again. So it's just a really great opportunity to network and get comfortable talking to other people, again, about your idea or building partnerships when you're ready to build partnerships. And then, of course, we can't get away without talking a little bit about UC Davis Venture Catalyst, my group. And so that's what this lower set with the boxes are. So just a couple I wanted to point out here and how they relate to some of the innovators you're going to be seeing over the next several days. So let's see. So National Science Foundation's I-Core program is one that's really well recognized across the country. And basically, it's really for people who've maybe come up with an invention or a technology, and they're trying to figure out who that customer truly is and what the business case could be for continuing to develop that technology beyond their personal use in their lab. Is it worth doing a startup? Is it worth filing a record of invention with the IP office? Is it worth patenting? And so that program can be really powerful. We actually have Beth Metcham and Matthew, I'm sorry, I don't remember your last name. Bustamante. But yeah, so they were on a team together, and they actually just did the 10-day program where they interviewed, I believe, over 15 in different customers to learn, again, where in that supply chain they should be playing, all the way from the bakers who might be using the nuts in their breads, from the harvest, the people harvesting and storing the walnuts, and everyone in between. Where should they play? Should they be playing in walnuts? Should they be playing in pecans? Should they be playing in olive oil? It was a great opportunity to just really suss through that stuff. And so during the regional boot camp, that's really where you get to that customer value articulation. And then if they go to the national program, having completed that first course, that's really where they get into saying, okay, how would that actually work? What are the nuts and bolts of building a business model around that if we were to do a startup? Or if we were to develop this technology enough so that somebody else could license and sell this technology to the industry. So thank you for being my example. Another program is our STARE Proof of Concept Grant program. You can almost think of it like a mini SBIR. It's $50,000 for 1 year of research to hit some sort of milestone. And that's actually an example of something that Dr. Dukovsky used for his triticale research. He had a really great track record with wheat, and he had a great track record with growing triticale, but not necessarily triticale for human use. So he had his $50,000 grant to do that exploration of what the market looked like, what the human dimension of uptake of that innovation might be. For innovators that are a little bit further down the line, they understand their customer, they have an invention, maybe they're starting to work on their business model, but they really need to form a legal entity so that they can license the technology from the university to keep working on it. That's when they join our START program. And the START program has some really crazy acronym, something about startup something accelerating research translation, startup toolkit for accelerating research translation. And so with that, we provide access to legal support, access to bank accounts and accounting help, and helping out with market research and access to database, access to mentors, things like that, to really get just the logistics of getting a business going, kind of moving along. And during that process, this is also when people start needing outside money to keep building their product and project and actually start generating their own intellectual property outside of the university. Some people are happy to just spin it up out of the university and license it as they go, but a lot of people prefer to then spin it out and develop their own IP portfolios off campus. And so that's where that small business innovation research or small business tech transfer research grants can be really powerful. And so we provide grant writing workshops for innovators that are sort of at that stage that are ready to do so. And then finally, we host webinars, usually monthly, sometimes every couple of weeks, sometimes every 6 weeks, on just various topics related to innovation and entrepreneurship commercialization. So really, no matter where you are in your journey, you can tune into one of these webinars and just learn something new about how you form your team or how you manage your intellectual property or whatever that might be. And then finally, there's some really great off-campus resources as well. So I just wanted to list a few of them. HM Close's Life Science Innovation Center and AgStart have, which is up in Woodland, provide lab space. So if you're doing anything a little bit biotech-y, that's available to you. Hacker Lab is based in Sacramento, and they have an amazing prototyping and maker space. Another maker space that has some hybrid space that I realized isn't on this list is Inventopia. They're based here in Davis and is actually founded by an engineering school alum and serial entrepreneur. And then as far as trainings go, and getting some funding mechanisms in place for little seed grants here and there, little seed investments, Sacramento State's Carlson Center has all kinds of training programs going on all the time. So they're a really great mailing list to sign up for. Startup Sac's mailing list is really great to do. They partnered up with the city of Elk Grove, and so now they're doing competitions and there's money to be had there. And then there are 2 accelerators. So I mentioned Thrive Accelerator, but then the Growth Factory is, I believe, in Rancho Cordova, and they're cutting $100,000 checks to entrepreneurs that are specifically from the Sacramento metro area who have a high growth potential idea. So, and I know that they also are working with food and ag teams. So like I say, this will all be in a deck that is going to be shared in your campus or your course resources, because I know I just threw a lot at you. But at this point, I'd love to just turn it over to you all for discussion. And I'm also going to be here at lunchtime. So if you have like a specific question for your particular situation, we can hack on that then as well. Whew. That was a marathon. We got this. We did it. Okay.
Thank you, boss. Any questions here? Don't get me started because I have like 20. Thank you. I'm assuming that those startups that succeed and bring a commercial product to market probably don't outnumber those that don't succeed.
Oh yeah, the fail.
So what is there a common thread? I mean, what's the most common reasons, or are you just scattered all over the place in terms of those that don't succeed?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, and I'm glad you brought it up. So there was actually a really powerful study that was done just a couple of years ago among venture capital firms who are, putting massive amounts of money in and actually only expect 2 or 3 out of 10 startups to radically succeed. And they said, well, so given that you're trying to pick winners here, what happened to all the ones that didn't win? And it turned out that, sure, running out of money is one of those issues, but really running out of money is a symptom of something else going on. Because if you have everything else going well, the money will flow to you. You just have to be looking in the right places and connected to the right people. So I'd say the biggest points of failure, like looking at this diagram again, is where people invent something and then assume somebody's just going to partner with them and license it. and they don't do their homework on whether or not there's truly a customer. And a lot of the time they assume they know who the customer is, and then they talk to the customer and it turns out that the customer isn't interested, or that the product is way too over engineered and expensive, and they actually would have bought something that was a lot less engineered had it been less expensive. So there's a lot that goes into people who don't pay attention to their customer. And like in my case with my startup, I can tell you exactly why we failed. We failed in part because we were creating a specialty product that had a premium price for a commodity market, and that just does not compute. And then also we had team members with very different needs and sort of cross purposes, in terms of one person wanted to grow really fast and get investment right away, but we hadn't done our homework with our customers yet, so we couldn't. Another person had a day job and could kind of take their time. Another person had just had a baby and had a side job besides. Like, it was just chaos. So a lot of the time I think about it as team, market, and technology. If you don't have a technology that functions, at least in a basic sense, you're not going to have a company. If you don't have a team that can work together, you don't have a company. And if you don't have a market, you don't have a company. So I tend to kind of think in those ways, because then the money will follow if those three stool legs are functioning properly. Yeah, great question.
Anybody else? This also addresses the question that was posted online. They asked, what are the main challenges related to intellectual property, or where is where we fail the most? They did ask that online, and then, but they added, how, lack of understanding, or all these challenges that we experience with intellectual property or technology development. How do you consider that this is actually affecting basic needed science research and development? Is it affected? Or, in other words, like, are people just wanting to make money, and if there's no money, then we don't do anything? What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, it's a mixed bag. I think, if I understand the question correctly, so people in the chat, let me know if I'm not answering your question. But there are definitely opportunities for smaller scale deployments, and doing a lifestyle business or something like that. Again, like working in the I-Core program recently with that boot camp, one of the ideas that somebody had is not going to be $1 billion idea that's going to be backed by venture capitalists. But if the technology moved maybe 2 or 3 steps up the technology readiness level to the point where it's manufacturable, that might make a really great 3 to 5 person small business that becomes a fixture in the value chain for that particular industry. So I think that that's the part where sometimes we just have to adjust people's expectation about, like, if it's not a venture backable $1 billion idea, is that still interesting to you, the innovator, because you're passionate about solving a problem? And given your personal circumstances or your team's circumstances, like, does that all still pencil? But yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of really amazing innovation out there that unfortunately dies on the vine. And I think part of my mission and the mission of folks like me is to really try to get more of that stuff up and out by whatever means makes the most sense.
Comments or questions from you? If not, I have one. If you don't mind,
We got one right there.
perfect.
I just wanted to ask, in terms of like the funding, what's the, like, people, like, certain entities are funding your ideas? How does that translate later on when your idea sort of grows? Like, do you pay them back? Like, what's the ownership of who's funding entities in your ideas?
It's a really great question. So it sort of depends. For most grant-making institutions, you don't have to pay it back, and they have no stake in your intellectual property. But there is usually a pretty large reporting responsibility because that's how they measure their success as opposed to it being financial success. So just being prepared for that trade-off is really important. There are groups like the Gates Foundation that actually do have clauses in their grants sometimes that do say, if you produce something valuable and then abandon the intellectual property, we have rights to it. That does happen sometimes, but it's definitely more so the exception than the rule. You know, for example, the SBIR, STTR programs at government agencies, they want you to own that intellectual property, build a strong company around it, and create jobs. It's really a job creation program by and large. Now with angel or investor money, and with even accelerators and venture capitalists, like they're looking for a return on their investment. And based on what this gentleman was just saying about the failure rate of early stage startups, they're making really big bets with hopes of really, really big returns on their investment because they need those returns to cover all their losses from the startups that didn't work out. So if you can't make them, with their portion of their ownership in your company, at least 10 times the value of the investment that they put in, they're probably not going to be interested, for example. That's just sort of like a basic rule of thumb there. So yeah, different people are going to have different motivations for putting money in. And as you get to know that landscape, you'll get to know how much money they're willing to put in, what stage of investment they're willing to put in, what their motivations are in terms of this being agricultural versus climate change versus human health, et cetera. Because yeah, all of those investors are slightly different.
I have one question. So
Yeah.
you've seen Hazel Technology as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And don't take this as a fact because I don't recall off the top of my head, but I believe that Hazel Technology relies on one MCP. So
That sounds about right.
they're blocking. I mean, it's a hormone that blocks the receptors of equity.
Mm-hmm.
There were two different patents, and that's why that's where my question is going. And I think it was at the beginning of the early 2000s. I think it's 2001 or 2002.
Okay.
Where there was what was called a use patent and a formulation patent from one institute for one specific company.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, one expired before the other. Don't ask me which one. I think the use patent expired in 2015, and the formulation patent expired in 2018.
Okay.
So I want to understand kind of like the difference between what is the use patent, the formulation patent, and how specifically did Hazel take advantage of this opportunity, because they basically were using or are using already a well-known compound that's been used before, only that they kind of, I don't want to say finagle it, just they worked it in a way where they're distributing it differently. And that brings me to kind of like the third question. Then what type of patent does Hazel have if those other two have expired? There's several.
Yeah. Yeah, there's several. Yeah, there's several. Yeah, there's. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so there are a ton of them out there. And I think that, and I can't speak to Hazel's specific IP portfolio. So I am going to have to speak a little bit in generalities here. But basically, and the reason I know about Hazel as much as I do is because they were part of my VentureWell grantee portfolio. And so I started working with them when they were PhD students and so on. But so basically, you said use patent versus formulation patent was the first one?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, at the most fundamental of levels, it's basically that. So there are different ways people might be creating ethylene inhibitors or hormones that do the same thing. But what they're saying, or what the person with that particular patent is saying, is you might find another way to do this, but you can't use our way of doing it. And that's the formulation part. Meanwhile, the use part is, well, who's using it and how are they using it? So for example, if they've got their technology, again, hypothetically, that has fields of use in certain geographies or certain types of fruits and vegetables, but not other types of fruits and vegetables. They might have only filed, and usually a use patent is also known as a utility patent. So how is it being utilized? What were the use cases that people were thinking of when they invented it? So that is where people have to be really careful, because sometimes they come up with new use cases that they didn't file on. But then if somebody else comes up with the same use case, same, similar technology, different formulation, you still might be able to have a little bit of a fence around that. And then that person has to license from you to do that. So yeah, it's a little messy, but basically to your point about these patents, they expire, right? So then it really becomes a game of market share. So how established are you in the industry? Did you pick the right part of the value chain to play in where you can dominate? Do you actually have a strategy for how you're moving forward as quickly and as efficiently as possible? Because what has happened with some of these other preservation technologies that are out there is they actually did go out and raise massive amounts of venture capital really early on. And now those venture capitalists want their 10x return. And if they try to go public, the public isn't going to pay the per share price that the venture capitalists had said this was going to be worth. And the venture capitalists are going to lose their money and they're going to be really upset. So there is some really interesting stuff that goes on in this marketplace right now where you have to be really efficient with your money and your strategy, because if you're not and you just go for the dominance play, you might have somebody that actually is coming in and eating your lunch, and now your company's overvalued and it's actually valued here. So yeah, lots of different factors at play there. But yeah.
You don't mind me?
Oh, Mike, yeah.
Please.
Yeah.
That we're seeing recently that all these companies are very aggressively commercially.
Mhm.
They're attacking retailers or big supermarkets. So that's the reason, because some companies, including the company that they work to, we need to explore it. We need
Yeah.
to be constantly testing. Some of them are providing really solid results or not, and or some work in certain items, or others. But at the point, why we need to start at this is because of retailers. They are retailers. Sometimes they don't know what they're asking. In the past, for example, Walmart, we eat fresh.
Yeah.
From South America, for many years, all this stuff we program had to do whatever it was there. But after the study, or I don't know what happened, we stopped with that portal for the growth. At the end, our growth is very.
Yeah.
This is another issue that all these companies have. They are lack of correlation. You don't understand what the means.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Yeah.
once you know what is the active ingredient of fruit, because some of them provide information, but some of them not.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are getting residues.
Yeah. 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 And I think just there are a few things that you hit on there that I think is really powerful, which is that idea that you need to figure out the people. You can't just assume you're going to sell to growers or sell to real retailers. You actually have to go out and talk to humans. It's actually an amazing book called Talking to Humans that's all about that. And it is. It's because something could make a lot of sense logically or on paper, and then you actually go out and talk to the retailers, and they say, "Nope, our margins are too thin. We can't we can't afford your 1 cent per crate cost. But then you have somebody else who says, well, but I would pay a little extra if I knew that something was going to come to me fresh. You know, and maybe that's also the difference between Walmart versus Target versus Whole Foods versus Safeway. Like, people actually have to go out and do that footwork, because not all retailers are the same, just as growers aren't necessarily the same too, right? And so I think that you really hit on something there. And I think that also one thing that came up for me while you were just talking is the fact that really we are going to need solutions that span the value chain. You know, we're going to need solutions that slide into our groceries at home when, you know, we put them in the vegetable drawer. We're going to need solutions that are at the cold storage at the grocers. We're going to need solutions during the shipment process. And sometimes those solutions will play all the way through the chain, and sometimes you're going to need different things for different places or different things for different foods. So, I mean, I think it's a huge, huge opportunity for a lot of people to attack the food waste issue. Yeah, there's plenty of room for everybody to play their part, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So, cool.
So I'm taking a little
Yeah.
bit more time. I should probably lie to you, and the reason why I'm taking a little bit more time is because I do think that, I mean, this is the only part where we talk about the technology, the development phase and the patent phase. We then go deep into talking about specific technologies. I think that Janine is a phenomenal resource in understanding, and better understanding how we can move that technology further. And one of my questions really is, and I don't have an answer to this, as professors, as extension specialists, as engineers, we're good engineers. We like to, I tell people they pay me to play. And that's what I know.
Nice.
I have the best job in the world. But that said, how can faculty, researchers, extensions people work together with private industries? We have those two different separate lines. It's almost like there's a distinction between technology that we're developing here in the university and technology developed by third-party companies, and it's separate. It's separate. But how can we early work together and connect each other's interests, basically?
Yeah, so there are two things that are coming to mind here. So I'm going to answer two different versions of that question that I heard. So one of them is that, yeah, I mean, just as much, I mean, maybe your customer or your customer value articulation is a large corporate, and there's actually an opportunity to partner with them early on to make sure you're building the thing that they would want to adopt 5 years from now. And actually with that proof of concept grant program that Venture Catalyst runs, we actually do have people from industry and investors on our panels, so that they can, like, the benefit to them is they get to sort of peek behind the curtain and see what's in the pipeline without any risk to them. And at the same time, the innovators that submit to the grant program get feedback, anonymized feedback, from these review panels, so that they can iterate on their innovation regardless of whether or not they get the grant, and they can build something that the industry will actually potentially want. That's also where these boot camps, the Entrepreneurship Academy, the I-Core program, that really aggressively makes you go out and talk to people in industry, is a really great way to get that moving. I know this isn't an agricultural example, but in the program we ran most recently, some students were in the group. They interviewed, I think, 16 people over the course of over the 10 days. They mostly had to interview surgeons, who are infamously difficult to get a hold of. If anybody here has tried to book a surgery, right? Getting 15 minutes with these people is almost impossible. They had surgeons talking to them for over 2 hours and then leaving the conversation saying, wait, what are you working on? I just told you all about my problems. I told you all about what keeps me up at night. Now you know what you want to do, but wait, what are you working on, and how can I support you moving forward? And now they have people who are like lining up to be mentors or grant co-sponsors for them because they had the courage to get out of the building. And so I really recommend doing structured programs like that to get comfortable with those types of relationships on a personal level. But then also at a structural level, sorry, I'm going to whip through this. This is also where on-campus resources can be really powerful. So, for example, the Foundation in Corporate Engagement group on campus curates relationships between large corporations and foundations looking to support fundamental research or translational research. And so going the sponsored research path, where you partner with somebody really early on, and then there's sort of the plan that in that relationship along the way, they'll license it on the back end eventually. That's also a totally viable route.